Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, my investigations took me to the November 1896 issue of the Century magazine. Particularly of interest in this magazine is an essay by a man named Duncan Rose, who's described as the son of a Confederate officer. His essay attracted much attention after it was published, particularly by veterans. Why? Because he offered his thoughts about why the South lost the Civil War. He had three main reasons, and I want to share them with you just to give you a sense of how individuals, how Americans of the late 19th century were in this very, very large debate about why exactly the Southern nation did not achieve victory after 4 bloody years of war. Lots of reasons, lots of thoughts. And of course, everyone is offering their own opinions. This is how we do it in America. We all share what we know and what we think we know. And Duncan Rose put his in writing. And so I want to give you the three reasons because you may find them somewhat surprising. So here we go. Reason number one: the Confederate government was smothered and strangled to death with its own irredeemable paper money. Let me read you a little bit of the description, give you a little bit of the idea of where Duncan's coming from. He says, quote, "It has been proved beyond shadow of doubt and cavil that war cannot be waged with paper money. Our forefathers proved it in the War of the Revolution, and had not the French and the Dutch come to their rescue with real money, the American government, with its continental bills, would have been strangled like the Confederacy and would likewise have died a mourning. However well or ill paper bills may answer for money in time of peace, in time of war, they will not do. Ah, those beautiful paper bills, so nice and clean and pretty, but every one as deadly as a foe to the South as an armed enemy. And how the people ran to get them, and how those printing presses rumbled, all printing paper money. They shook the earth and almost drowned the noise of the cannon wheels rolling to the front. A Southerner should hate the sight of one of those paper bills. Every one of them represents blood fruitlessly spilled, treasure wasted, and hopes blasted. But in the beginning of the struggle, no one seemed to suspect an enemy in that beautiful money. The government, at least, acted upon the theory that all it had to do to raise money was to print it. They did not seem to realize that, being the largest purchaser in the market, it was necessary for the government to keep down prices as much as possible, inflation, that every issue of bills must inevitably raise prices and render a new issue necessary, that every rise in prices must be followed by a new issue until the bubble must collapse of its own expansion and redundancy. So there's Duncan Rose's argument about the economy. Now, here's one, number two, that relates to combination of the government and the military. Here it is: the policy of dispersion, number two. Here's the explanation. Quote, "The frontiers of the Confederacy extended over many thousands of miles. The policy which the government adopted in the beginning of the war and upheld to the end was that every foot of that frontier must be defended. To this end, the whole Confederacy was divided into military districts, and to each general there was given a definite geographical command, as the president of the Confederacy himself stated it. So the defense of the Confederacy was made purely a question of geography. Each general of a district was expected to drive back all enemies crossing his frontier without much regard to what was going on in the other districts. The better to carry out this idea, the capital itself was removed from Montgomery into the interior to Richmond near the frontier, where it was expected that most of the fighting would take place. And the defense of the shallow North Carolina Sounds in the rear of Richmond was deemed of more importance than that of the passes of the Appalachians. A policy more fatal to success could not have been adopted. The armies of the Confederacy were wrecked and wasted in the vain effort to defend its capital and the extended, indefensible frontier. End quote. Now, one thing I'll add in this passage, it reminded me of the idea of manifest destiny and where the United States before the war was. We were all about expansion. We were all about taking over lands and territories. And of course, in the world where you had the pro slave and anti slave factions who were debating how states in the frontier in the West would come into the Union, that feeds this narrative about how important territory is. And so it's not a surprise that when the government in Richmond or Montgomery and then Richmond forms, that the idea of preserving all of that territory for slavery is part of the equation. Now, number 3 says Duncan Rose is pure military. And here it is, the neglect of the cavalry. Here's what Rose has to say. Quote, "It is fact worthy of remembrance that all the greatest generals of ancient and modern times have put their greatest faith in their cavalry. And so it has come to be considered an axiom that, however authorities may differ as to the relative value of the different arms of the service in battle, no great decisive victory can be won without sufficient cavalry to press the pursuit. That the fruits of victory cannot be gathered, the harvest cannot be reaped without sufficient fresh men on horseback to pursue the retreating enemy. It might be expected that, as the Southerners were natural born horsemen, cavaliers from the cradle, the mounted arm of the service would have been the strongest and the most valued and cherished. But, strange as it seems, the contrary, the very contradictory of that was true. From the beginning, the cavalry was relatively the weakest, was underrated and neglected, and even ridiculed and derided. In jocularity, rewards were offered for a dead man with spurs on such a poor opinion had they of a soldier on horseback. At the first great battle of the war on the plateau of Manassas, the mounted men did not even fight as an organized body, but were divided, detailed, and attached 2 companies to each brigade in imitation, perhaps, of the old Roman legion, a method of arranging cavalry in battle which was abandoned before the Christian era. And yet, Johnston had been blamed because he did not capture the Federal Army and the city of Washington, too. And at the times after, that little band of horsemen never seemed to be considered as a constituent part of the fighting army. Nearly always they were separated from it on detached duty. At Gettysburg, the Confederate cavalry was miles away when the battle began. They were not a factor in the great fight until the last day. If Lee had won and had captured the heights of Gettysburg, it could have been, in effect, more than a drawn battle because he had not sufficient cavalry with which to press the pursuit. End quote. So there's the 3 reasons. They have been excerpted from a fairly long article, fairly long essay written by Duncan Rose. But these excerpts, I hope, give you a flavor of the 3 reasons that he believed that the South was unable to win the war. The cavalry part of it, that last part, was interesting to me too, because nowadays the script that Duncan Rose wrote has been flipped. The idea of the Confederate cavalryman, that trooper, that cavalier, although he references it, we don't think of the Confederate cavalry as being a subordinate part. We think of them being in their heyday and being an aggressive factor. But of course, we all know, we students of the Civil War know, that at Gettysburg, Stuart was basically out of commission as he was out of sight. So, anyway, thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.